all I can say about Raul is that really he was a lion amongst men, that, one man is 10,000 if he's best, but he was 1,000,000. So definitely that's what I remember the most about him, about his gaze, his candid speech, and his selflessness.
Raul was definitely very smart, but he was also very mature, which is, I think, something that, a lot of people that I have met online lack. He was just a very authentic and real person to talk to. You could also talk to him about things that weren't politically related. I could always learn something from him as well. There's very few people I could talk to in my life that I actually felt like they would teach me something. And that's not to sound egotistical or anything, but, when I would speak to him, I would often find myself humbled in a good way and say to myself, wow, I never thought of, this topic in this way. And, as a matter of fact, a lot of the thinking that I've done since meeting him has often been directly influenced by him. And I let him know that because I was very grateful to have somebody like that in my life.
So let's say legionaries. I am joined here by gentlemen of austere standing in the great struggle of our time. Of course, everyone here is very familiar with one General Lance Legion, but we are joined by a new friend, a true imperator of this general zeitgeist, which we are heralding, and he goes by Gabriel Sprach. And today, we want to begin by honoring a truly noble man who I talked about briefly on Twitter. I did a post here as well. Obviously, that is RAUL GIAMMATTEO. He was working on a translation of Marinetti before he passed away. And we want to honor him today, talk about his life, talk about what happened. And then from there, just talk about the general philosophies that have come out of the great nation of Italy, because there is so much that has come out in the past 200 years, especially the past 100 years. But without further ado, Gabriel, if you could just briefly introduce yourself to the legionaries.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you guys for inviting me here today. I've been around for a few years. I think I started posting content in 2022 or 21 on YouTube. I've made most of my content is sort of a combination of philosophy and politics and how those two relate to one another. I started off basically, I was taking notes on books I was reading and then reading those notes into YouTube, and that kind of just slowly evolved over into more organized videos and later on interviews. And yeah, so that's pretty much what I do.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, we're here today to discuss the life of Raul. So if either one of you want to sort of talk about him first, since, like I mentioned before, you two knew him better than I did.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say is that I think the important thing to remember is that he was a regular guy. And I think that ultimately men in times of crisis reveal themselves. And I think that in a world of so much cowardice and materialism, Raul was one of those guys that, basically stood up against the current and showed people a different way. I met him a long time ago, obviously via the internet, like just in passing. The funny thing is the internet is a great place because you can just meet with people who are not necessarily of your own political or philosophical persuasion, but still kind of blossom into a friendship that is enlightening and excites arete in each other. And so, the challenge that we're facing now today throughout the West, and I suppose the world, is that, somehow it's acceptable to visit violence and state-sanctioned violence upon people whom we disagree with and who frankly have superior morals and kind of philosophical pursuits than the vast majority of individuals calling themselves people. And ultimately, all I can say about Raul is that really he was a lion amongst men, that, one man is 10,000 if he's best, but he was 1,000,000. So definitely that's what I remember the most about him, about his gaze, his candid speech, and his selflessness. but go ahead, Gabriel.
Yeah, so we're almost approaching 2026. I had met Raul in 2020, and at the time I must have been, going on 18 years old. I was posting about traditionalism on a different platform. I was, posting about Evola and other philosophers, and he had followed me. We briefly spoke around that time, but not too much. He also helped my friend translate some stuff. But around 2021, we became closer to one another. I'm half Italian, as a lot of people know, and obviously we spoke a lot about Italy, and we became very good friends, so much so to the point where we essentially spoke every single day. I spoke to him every single day up until the day that, he was attacked. We would have, 5-hour phone calls. These would be very, for lack of a better term, chuddy phone calls, just for hours on end. I used to actually, when I was at work, I used to leave work, sneak out of work just to have these phone calls with him and then go home. So, him and I, he was very much like a brother to me in many ways. And I had the pleasure of meeting him in real life back in January 2025 when I was in Rome, and him and I attended the event Achilles, and that was probably one of the best trips I've ever done in my life. I've been to Italy many times, but never for anything like that. And just in that short little stay, I think I was there for only a week in Rome. And that was definitely a trip to remember. And I was hoping to go with him this year, but unfortunately we can't. But Raul was definitely very smart, but he was also very mature, which is, I think, something that, a lot of people that I have met online lacked. And I guess that's just kind of the nature of the internet. It allows for the worst to come out in people, but he was always very level-headed. And that's why I enjoyed speaking to him so much, because he was, just a very authentic and real person to talk to. You could also talk to him about things that weren't politically related. So that was also just something I actually really valued, was that I could have an in-depth political discussion with him, always about something new, always. I could always learn something from him as well. There's very few people I could talk to in my life that I actually felt like they would teach me something. And that's not to sound egotistical or anything, but, when I would speak to him, I would often find myself humbled in a good way and say to myself, wow, I never thought of, this topic in this way. And, as a matter of fact, a lot of the thinking that I've done since meeting him has often been directly influenced by him. And I let him know that, because I was very grateful to have somebody like that in my life. So.
Absolutely. And obviously, I did not know him as long as you guys did. He joined, so basically around the time that Lance and I started collaborating, we started coming up with this idea of New Rome, to sort of just a symbol and a name to describe our general vibe, let's say. And of course, Lance and Raul had talked for some time at that point, and he joined our group chat it's called the Legio di Nova Roma. And, we would talk a bit on the GC mainly, occasionally outside as well. But when I was going to Rome about 2-3 months ago, I had told him, because I knew obviously that, he had all the connections there. And despite the fact that we had never met, he told many of his friends there, to sort of look out for me when I got there. He was telling me all the places to check out, whether that, was different monuments or different, let's say, special bookstores, with quotation marks around that, special bookstores and special bars and whatnot. And, he was telling people about me, despite the fact that he never met me, just because we talked online, and, essentially vouching for me, which, I was very humbled by. And, we followed each other on our normal person Instagrams, not just the not just the ex Anon accounts. Of course, I've never been Anon, but I don't put my name out there for people to look me up. And we followed each other on our personal Instagrams. But I guess what really struck me about him was how much he helped out, and even in a little way like that, despite, like I said, us not knowing each other as well as, for example, you guys knew him. But I was very grateful for that. And we talked about meeting, like Gabriel mentioned, the next Congress in January 2026. We were talking about that. I talked to Lance about that a little bit, and it was a very exciting thing to plan these things. We definitely wanted to meet, and I was hoping to. And of course, what happened to him was just terrible. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, he essentially was killed due to essentially a migrant in Spain, and he was in a coma for 50 days before he passed away. Just a pointless death. This just shouldn't have happened, but he died as he lived, as I say, fighting. This was a guy, I think Lance touched up on it. He just had this look about him, which was a combination of serious, but also a sort of artistic flair as well. I saw the self-portrait that he made for you, Gabriel. Like, obviously, he was a very artistic person as well. The edits he would post on Twitter. Sometimes, especially after his death, I would just look through his Twitter feed and look at all those edits. This was a guy with an eye for aesthetics, and a very special person. And of course, we saw many people posting about him, even people who didn't know him. Obviously, Student Bloc and all these other different groups in Italy carried banners with his name. Comrade, RAUL GIAMMATTEO present. He's still with us. This is death is it is death of the body, but not of the spirit. His spirit never died. He never coped. And I think something Gabriel was telling me that I found to be quite touching was Gabriel, you told me, Raul basically said he didn't want to die old and decrepit. He would prefer to die young and beautiful, full of vitality and energy. And I think this is precisely the spirit of, let's say, the right in general, is quality over longevity. It is excellence over comfort. And honestly, anti-utilitarian thought over utilitarian thought. It is about the transcendent. It is about the sublime. It is about art. It is about greatness and beauty rather than trying to create societies for the lowest common denominator. And this is why someone like Raul dying was so touching to me. And, recently another friend of mine actually passed away in a motorcycle accident. This is someone I hung out with and knew relatively well, but I did not feel nearly, and this is not to sound crass or morose, but I didn't feel as much of an impact when he died than when Raul died. And I never met Raul in person, because I think on the internet, we're connected in a different way. It allows us to connect to people that we wouldn't otherwise meet in person, people with that same sort of fire, the same interests. And by knowing even that we read the same books, we can sort of assume things about each other, and it connects us in a special way. And I'm droning on a little bit here, of course, but maybe we can begin to talk about the general zeit that Raul represented and what will go on eternally of his name in this sort of movement of thought and idea and of aesthetics that will continue long after his death.
Yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing is that, like, first of all, heroes never die, and that's the truth. And it's interesting because I was reviewing, obviously, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy by Dr. Alamaru. And it's interesting to me that this is a recurring theme, certainly in Western civilization, but in all civilizations as a whole, about the, I guess, struggle between the demos and the best, the aneri, agathoi, I suppose. And, it's like a recurring thought that happens. And it really, I suppose the interesting thing is that for as much as we may believe that there is a mass appeal, the more I live, the more I realize how unique and, let's say, small this cohort of people are. And I mean, Nietzsche really talks about this. It's unfair to expect excellence of the many. You rob excellence, of its value by making it popularized or democratized. And so, there is some merit to that. But I think for myself, I suppose this is my latent ambition, is to see all of humanity to live gloriously and full of life and natural vigor in the same way Raul did. And, just physical and mental, spiritual robustness and strength. So, just to kind of, I guess, bring it full circle here, because we're going to talk about a lot of Italian philosophy, and many of the things that we spoke about. Obviously, Raul was translating Marinetti. Marinetti, of course, is a dynamic figure who inspired both left and right. He's, like all great thinkers, they're beyond these arbitrary, let's say, political philosophical questions, right? They are beyond these things. And the interesting thing about Marinetti is precisely this idea of effectively choosing a life of dynamism and energy. And the interesting thing is that when he was writing the corpus of his work, him, Marinetti, D'Annunzio, and so on, much of the philosophical, let's say, construction was built in a time of great stuffiness, and a time when Europe, just like in our day, is felt to be a living walk-in museum. And they wanted to tear it all down so that way they could make way for a higher life, to a higher feeling of speed and excellence and just simply living vigor. And what's interesting to me is that, like, I mean, how do you attain that? And to them, in their time, it had to do with embracing the philosophies of their immediate future, which was obviously for them a certain level of democracy, a certain level of nationalism, also militarism, and a kind of, let's say, unrequited, or no, not unrequited, but unapologetic sense of self and egotism in a positive way. And it's interesting to me because, we live in this time and it feels like the world is a walk-in museum that's increasingly impoverished. But worse is that liberalism, neoliberalism, really creates ciphers of us all. It creates this ennui, the sense of ennui, the sense of listlessness, of uniformity, universalization of the same. And it was said of the Romans that when they go and conquer a place, they take it and make it a desert. And living in our time, it gives you special insight as to what that statement means, as far as what it means in us, in our personal life, every day, day to day, in that, it's just basically more of the same spiritual desert. Everyone's the same. Everyone has prefabricated ideas and ideals, preset subforms of life. And that's the part of philosophy that's interesting, is precisely that it makes you unique. It makes you truly develop the inner self and seek excellence as inborn and revealed through your action. But, I don't want to drone on too much. Gabriel, why don't you take it away with any kind of thoughts that you may have regarding this kind of topic?
Yeah, so you made a good point there. You said something about how modernity creates this kind of listlessness and universality, and I think it's a good point. But there's also I think there's a difference between universality and unification, and I think the difference can be that in vulgar, I guess we can call it vulgar universality, where things are reduced to the lowest common denominator and stripped of any essence, and basically just really completely focused on function more than anything. That's kind of the universality of modernity. Whereas if you have proper unification, where various, let's say for example, I'll make it more concrete. A nation or a people unites their spirit as becomes one, and they're united towards not only bettering the nation and themselves, but imposing that on the rest of the world in some sense. And that's kind of like the birth of empires in many ways. Like that's why you could argue that there's a difference between something like the Roman Empire and American globalism. One was, yes, unity is present in both, but there's one is an inverted form of unity where things are reduced down to the worst that they could possibly be, whereas in the other form of unity, things are unified in a way that basically elevate them through the act of unity. I think that is I think modernity is kind of symbolized or maybe not symbolized, I guess a better word for it would be characterized by this kind of reduction of things down to the lowest common denominator. I mean, this is certainly not an original idea to me at all. There's, plenty of traditionalist philosophers have spoken about this kind of thing. And I'm not necessarily, a full-blown traditionalist, but I definitely think that's like one of the best points that they ever made. And I think that, especially with a lot of Italian philosophy, especially D'Annunzio, he really rejected this idea of, reducing things down to essentially just be lower forms of what they could be. And that's, there's Bowden did a speech on D'Annunzio, and he kind of, I don't know if this was his idea himself or if he got it from D'Annunzio directly, but he spoke of D'Annunzio as this man who was one with the crowd and above them at the same time. And I think that's like that really kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to talk about in a single sentence. I think that there is a way to unify people towards something higher, with not only not reducing them down to the lowest common denominator, but also elevating them to their highest potential. And I think that's kind of also characteristic of Futurism too, in many ways as well.
And speaking about that, obviously, I think one of the first times we interacted was you essentially QTing Lance and I's discussion on Sorel. And of course, one of the things we talked about in that podcast was the idea that Rome has many authors. And this is something that Ernst Renan talks about. Of course, Sorel is citing him to sort of talk about this sublime unity, which I think precisely is what you're bringing up here, is that take Rome, for instance. You were an individual within Rome. You were a Caesar. You were a Marius or a Sulla. You were an individual whose own feats were celebrated, but it was all within the context of also bettering the empire, or in the early times, the Republic. And I think this sort of is where Gentile tries to build off of Hegel and the state as like this sort of ethical, spiritual entity beyond just institutions, beyond the material. And I do resonate with that quite a bit. And particularly what I resonate from that is something I'm kind of playing around with. And I think I'll do an essay on this. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well, Gabriel. But the state as a work of art, the state as something that has many authors. And this is something Lance and I talked about. The state with many authors. Some are named authors like Caesar, or in the case of France, you have named authors like Napoleon, or in the case of the United States, you have authors like Patton, right? These are the remembered authors who are part of the tapestry of their empire. But you also have the nameless legionary, who is not atomized. He is not just a cog in the machine. He is part of the machine too, which is precisely why it's not a machine anymore. It is this sort of living spiritual entity. The Roman legionary is remembered in the name of Rome, in the history of Rome, which is dynamic and progressing. This is one thing I think Hegel gets right, not a historical progress towards the absolute ideal, but a historical progress that is recorded, not just the temporal, but as temporal beings dealing with the infinite, we deal with it by being part of something greater than ourselves, obviously, which is the shortcoming, of course, largely of liberalism. And I was actually catching Gabriel, your conversation with Dugin. And of course, I wouldn't consider myself a big fan of Dugin, but one of the things that I do like that he talks about is sort of referring to peoples and states as Daseins, right? As these evolving entities, each with a sort of unique, a spiritual sort of identity, larger than just the atomized individual. And I think this is exactly, what you get with empire, and precisely why Evola hits the nail on the head with the nation contra Imperium, or the Imperium contra the nation sort of viewed from this leftist perspective almost, as a sort of product of modernity, versus the empire, which is unlike liberalism, like as in your conversation with Dugin, how it sort of atomizes the individual, how it imposes a false sense of freedom on the masses. It gets rid of any sort of unique Dasein of peoples, right? Which is why multipolarity has some bearing, even though I ultimately disagree with it. But the empire, you do still have those Daseins within the empire. You have the Gauls under the Romans. You have the Britons under the Romans. You have, the Greeks under the Romans. You have all these peoples who still exist and contribute, but they contribute also to this sort of greater identity, So I guess, Gabriel, what do you think about that? The state as a work of art, the state as a dynamic authorship.
Yeah, so I agree with that 100%. And ultimately, I think political theater is important. I think I have a tweet about this somewhere. I forget exactly what the tweet was, but essentially what I was saying is that the political should be theatrical. It should entertain people. And the nuncio obviously believed that, and like the whole concept of the balcony speech, which later then transitioned into a lot of things we saw in fascist Italy and other regimes. That's also like a very Roman inspired thing, I guess. And I think that is itself a direct expression of the state as a work of art. I also think that the inner workings of the state itself is a work of art, especially in a corporatist type state, where you have these different I guess you could call them organs that all have a different interest, but they all unify in the interest of the benefit of the nation. And the act of unity is essentially no different than how a band would work, right? Because any orchestra or any musical group, ultimately at the end of the day, they need to unite and find their place within each other to create something beautiful. And that's what the state does. The state basically unifies, a proper state, I should say, because a lot of states don't do this, but what I believe the state should do, and what it's always been meant to do, is to unify all the elements of a nation, or it could be, if it's larger, an empire, to basically work towards the vitality and keeping that state alive, and also the cultures within that. But of course, the culture isn't necessarily separate from the state, and this is why I believe in an organic state. I don't like this idea. This is especially, it's kind of the defining mark of liberalism in many ways, that the state is some sort of separate entity from the people, and that the state has to sort of, the people should ultimately limit the state, and the state is kind of seen as like this unfortunate necessary reality. I don't think that's how it should be at all. I believe that it should be sort of seen as like this organic expression of the people, and a system that works for their benefit, but is also, it's distinct and unified at once. Much like how you could look at like a four-leaf clover, right? Like the clovers are distinct from each other, yet they're unified as a clover in that case. And I think essentially the various aspects of a society or a nation, whatever you want to call it, ultimately, if they work together, and if the state can sort of guide them to work together, that is in and of itself a giant work of art, probably the largest work of art ever seen, and probably possible for human beings to create.
I don't want to interrupt, but I think I just want to kind of riff off that. It's interesting because this is like a recurring theme, and it's why Platonism as a philosophical school has such a long-standing and basically irrevocable place in philosophy, basically in human civilization as a whole. Obviously, Platonism, you can really parse it apart and say that a lot of it is derived from Egyptian theology and this and that and the other thing, but it was really with Plato and Socrates and the Socratics in general that fleshed out the idea, that unified the idea of not, I hate using the word state, because in the United States we have this false perception due to our liberal leftist past, where the state is this enemy, alien force. But what is the state really? The state is the crystallization of law, and laws are themselves crystallizations of customs being the organic expression of a Dasein, right? And so all these things are interrelated, and to the worst thing to have happened, which is falsely called the Enlightenment, is this concept of where it's like this sterile alien organization that lives above us and kind of tyrannizes us, and it's our job to destroy it as much as possible, because that's what they really mean. Like when a libertarian talks about the state, what they mean is it's negation, right? As much as possible. And ultimately there's some you know, there's this, I guess, correct view of, you know, too much, let's say, structure, too much overbearing top-down enforcement can be, let's say, stultifying. It can be suffocating, and this is absolutely correct. But it's not one or the other, right? It's the golden mean between the discipline of law and structure and the delegation of personal agency, i.e. freedom. And the interesting thing about the West and the liberal revolution of 1776 and 1789 is that it made us perceive something that is an aspect as the totality. What I mean by this is, of course, this false dualism of liberty and freedom. And what's curious to me is that what is freedom and what is it for? And that's something that Americans really, especially libertarians, unfortunately, you know, I've been a little bit frustrated recently because usually they're just boomers and they're sclerotic and they're incapable of actually having the mental dynamism to be able to be self-reflective and, you know, adjust their false consciousness to the reality, right? However, what I would say is this, is that it's interesting to me that it has come to the fore of a civilizational Dasein. I mean, this is not just in the United States, but elsewhere, but what is freedom for? And the founding fathers of the United States were very clear that's eudaimonia, right? Flourishing, human flourishing. And by natural law alone, you're able to criticize and circumvent, you can basically isolate what are the extremes of freedom, and you can qualify what is freedom by what leads to human flourishing, what doesn't. And so you see modern liberalism or libertarianism or neoliberalism, and all of these ideologies fundamentally are the enemies of human flourishing. And you know, the frustrating thing and the interesting thing is that because of the synthetic and removed nature of our existence, we're not able to qualify what does it necessarily mean to be flourishing. Everything is so abstract, but nature itself gives its, you know, let's say sign, right? What is flourishing truly? It's having a robust body, having a robust life, having a dynamic life, one of great creativity and creation and let's say true self-being, right? And the trouble is that because there are so many individuals, let's say bugmen, who perceive flourishing as basically the botched and the bungled, and therefore botch and bungle the rest of civilization, we're not able to criticize or give a reference to why it is that they should why is it that like freedom itself has limits, right? And I think the question of today is answering what is freedom for, because then we're able to actually give context to, you know, what does liberalism mean? Because I think both of you would agree that I don't think liberalism or freedom should be about mercantile exchange. It certainly isn't something about, you know, let's say mangling ourselves and the nation around us to suit our passing fancy. It's something higher. It's something more robust and naturalistic than both of these schema can offer. I know I've been droning on a little bit, and it's just something I've been gestating personally. But the answers that have been evoked are usually recurring, right? Like it's something that has been answered 3,000 years ago. And the reason why it's, let's say, repressed, why is it so unpopular, is because it is demanding. It demands people to be courageous. It demands people to actually have a lot of energy and resource and agency. And of course, these are things limited to a very small elite group of humans. I would say that's probably top 30%, top 20% of civilization as a whole. The trouble, of course, is that there's much money to be gained from being a demagogue, from ruling for the passions of the nomoi. And that's the challenge of our today is basically how is it that we're able to navigate the present so that way we can bring into being the future that's worth dreaming and living out. But anyway, Warrior, I've been droning on for a long time, but these are just thoughts that I've been just kind of kicking around in my head like a tin can. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, of course, I think that what it really goes down to, and this is sort of what I've been studying as of late in relation to Bataille and then to a lesser degree Heidegger, is essentially contra utility. And when people think of freedom, they think of the freedom to live and the freedom to have these sort of utilitarian necessities, healthcare, education, whatever. And the funny thing about the right is, of course, you say something like, well, I want universal healthcare, I want universal education, and the right will, the conservative right will be against that. And what they don't realize is the reason we would oppose that on the left is because they want these things for utility. They want these things so that, everyone can be comfortable, everyone can live, well, blah, 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 egalitarianism, equality. But from a different perspective, you view life as not about utility, but about seeking, as I say, the sublime, seeking that which does not necessarily have a clear purpose. You could also justify the state as a means of attaining that. So, for example, one of the things that I've seen Casa Pound do is they do free medical checkups, right? They have it's either free or subsidized housing for Italian families. These are things not done because of fairness or equality or egalitarianism, but to strengthen the base of your people, to strengthen the individuals in your society, in your collective, so that they can further expand the grandeur of, let's say, the state or the polity or the people, because there is a goal beyond the temporal. To the liberal, to this sort of boomer conservative, everything's about the now, right? There's no idea of a transcendent future. This is something Nietzsche critiques heavily, and this is what he says is lost when we lose tradition, when we lose an appreciation for mythos. We end up with a future that has no purpose of being furnished. There's no point in fertilizing the future anymore because there is no goal that we're attaining. This is the thing with liberalism and this idea of pursuit of happiness. Seek whatever pursuit of happiness you want. But most people are disappointing. Most people have no transcendent regard. They live for the temporal. They live for comfort now, right? And they sort of ignore this being to death. They try to numb the existential angst, anguish, as Bataille calls it. And of course, Heidegger refers to this as well, being to death. They numb it. They narcotize it. They're too afraid to face the infinite as finite beings. So instead of trying to build something infinite that is not necessarily themselves, but is an extension of themselves, as we talked about, with Rome in comparison to the legionary, or even we think about Raoul's life, right? Raoul lives on because he is part of something evolving. He is part of something beyond himself, beyond the temporal. And as a member of that, he is part of a piece of art, a tapestry that goes beyond. And the idea that freedom is having all these, commodities within the temporal is exactly why, liberalism is a failed system. There's no idea of that beyond utility, because ultimately, when you live merely for utility, there is no point to think about the future, right? What the future that we seek comes from expanding the boundaries, expanding through evolution. There's a reason why I would say people like Nietzsche and myself are sort of anti-Darwinian. Humans are not the most capable of surviving. We're actually quite fragile. We're not attuned to lots of different climates the way that a cockroach might be, for instance. A cockroach is perhaps the best being, lowercase being, in relation to its ability to survive. Perhaps if evolution were just about a will to life, well, why would we turn it to humans? And I think it is because of anti-utility. It's because the impulse of life develops over time through will to power. It emerges into such a thing where for life to move forward, for there to be new horizon, you can't just live for temporal. You can't just live for utility and commodities and all these things. You have to create and transvalue new limits to achieve, and that comes from things like art that don't necessarily have utilitarian purpose. That comes from separating yourself from freedom in the liberal sense and actually believing in something transcendent, something in the future, something beyond yourself, part of something that is larger, like the state as a spiritual entity. And maybe you have some thoughts on that, Gabriel.
Yeah, so there's two ideas that both you guys were speaking about that I thought were really good. If Lance kind of mentioned this before, if you tell an American that what is freedom, it's often a sense of freedom, like, oh, I can do this because the government can't let me, can't get in the way of me doing that. However, and if you were to tell an American, well, and this is ultimately a Hegelian idea, often seen, I think, from the philosophy of right, I do think that Hegel can absolutely be used from a right-wing perspective, and he has. I think even more so than he can in a left-wing perspective, but that's a whole other topic. But if you were to tell an American libertarian or conservative that, well, actually, there is no freedom without the state, I mean, their brain would short circuit. That's inconceivable to them. And, ultimately, the two ideas the idea that we spoke about before and this idea, they work directly together. Well, if you have an organic state that, authentically represents the will and the customs of the people, and, to use a term that Lance used, crystallized into the state. That's also why the state works, by the way, because if the state didn't in any way pertain to, the populace and understand its needs and how it thinks, and ultimately, if it didn't come from them, there would be such a discrepancy between the two that it would collapse. And sometimes that does happen when states become corrupt and tyrannical. But in the proper organic state, it would attend to the needs of the people. And through attending to those needs of the people, and these needs, of course, are not just material needs; they're spiritual needs, and ultimately, the highest need of a person, especially young men, is to actualize themselves through a community with other like-minded young men. That is in itself the highest form of freedom: the ability to actualize yourself for a cause or a higher purpose, and in many ways, that's the product of a state. Even with, the nuncio, taking over Fiume, well, what did he do? He created a state, from bottom up, essentially. And it was, the will of these veterans from World War I who had a shared common spirit, crystallized that into a state. And ultimately, yes, it was short-lived, but that doesn't really matter. It's really more so about the quality of the time than the quantity of the time. And I think, there's no, and this is why there's no liberal answer to modern problems, because the liberal answer would be to just work on yourself as an individual, but you are the individual isn't really real in the sense that they think it's real, because obviously, yes, there are distinct individuals, but those individuals are ultimately a product of other individuals, whether through direct reproduction, of course, but also through influence. The way you think and the way you act, it's a product of, in many ways, your interactions with other people and your experiences. You couldn't learn things if it wasn't for other people, and you get to know yourself through your interactions. Through working on something with other people. That's ultimately why, the military in many European countries was, I believe it, mandatory. I think part of that is, obviously there's, geopolitical concern there, but there's also the concern of molding, these young men into something greater than they are in the current moment. And I think that that's a perfect example of the organic state providing that freedom for society through
Right.
the organization of a state that recognizes the customs and the law of the people and the needs of the people. It then creates the conditions for the men in that society to act as a unit, to then really fully, and ultimately that freedom is to realize their potential and actualize it, is basically what I'm trying to say.
No, absolutely. And I think on top of everything else, it's not just for the men, it's also for the women, it's for society as a whole. I mean, if you look, I think one of the most sound critiques of liberalism is the absolutely precipitous fertility rate, right? It's, people do not want to have kids because when the immediacy of existence is about the now, right? That's what happens when you individualize people and cut them off from a greater meaning, is that they live for purely themselves. They may become atomic individuals. And just as you had indicated before, we're individuated parts of a whole, right? We're either parts of a nation, civilization, whatever it may be. And there is no insistence, there's no meaning, there's no purpose into having children if there's just no reason to being itself, right? What's the point of shitting out a kid when it's a lot of risk, it's very little immediate obvious reward, it's financially burdensome, it is physically, energetically burdensome. There is no quote unquote payoff, right? To use these gross materialistic terms. And the answer to these things, and for instance, culture, children, the organic expression of ideas and spirits, ultimately stems from great ideals. I mean, Nietzsche talks about the 1001 goals, and what makes nations distinct is what they hold as their highest good. And now, of course, highest goods are not necessarily, they're not utilitarian, right? They're by definition completely aesthetic. And this is what Ward talks about in aesthetic radicalism, is the purpose of life is aesthetic expression that has very little to do with the reality of day-to-day drudgery of life, for mere life, for just scraping by like a piece of fecal matter on the face of this earth until one day you expire. And so ultimately, for instance, what I mean by 1001 goals, if you read Nietzsche, and thus spoke there's Zarathustra, is, for instance, the Persians to shoot straight and speak the truth, and for the Jewish nation to honor mother and father, and for the Greeks is to excel all others and to love none except for a good friend. These are things that have compelled people through an erotic experience, spiritual experience. Obviously, it's not sexual in the base sense, has nothing to do with the base elements of sex per se. It is the animating spirit of the soul, which then plays out elsewhere, right? And this is the challenge, because ultimately we have a geriatric tyranny in which the olds are unwilling to change, and they're already in the way out. And the worst thing about our olds is that they're boomers, right? And so they have completely internalized the selfishness of their existence, and they believe that their childhood is a reflection of present day childhoods, but they don't understand that their childhood was the product of a previous generation that did not have these shared mores that boomers had, and that today's mistakes are the fruits of the poison tree that these individuals have planted. It's our job to uproot that tree and to plant something whose shade we'll never enjoy, more majestic bearing of fruits. Obviously, I think Warrior could talk more about this, but that is kind of our great thrust of what really Raul was living for, is maybe a future, an aesthetic future, a future worth living for, a future worth fighting for, a future worth dying for.
Yeah, I think going back to sort of how the state allows for freedom, of course, this is an idea that goes all the way back to Aristotle, and I think largely Hegel is very much influenced by politics of the writing Politics by Aristotle, where he talks about the state, as I said earlier, this sort of being tied to the ethics of the people and their ability to express themselves. You cannot express yourself without the state, without a state that's capable of violence, by the way. The thing that liberals don't understand is that to be an artist, you need the excess, you need the idle time to pursue the arts. You know, how did the Greeks attain such high levels of reason at the time? You know, how did they have the time to pursue the arts and the sciences and philosophies? It was off the backs of a slave class. It was off the backs of a lower peoples than them that they subjugated. It takes violence, and the state must wield violence to ensure these freedoms and to ensure the ability to pursue the sublime and to pursue that beyond utility. And it reminds me, going back to concept of the political, and what Schmitt talks about regarding the plurality of liberal societies, is you have all these factions that are representing their own interests contra the other interests of the other factions within the liberal state. There is no transcendent goal. There is no unifying orientation that each of these groups are pursuing that is shared in common with the others. So inevitably, there's never really this great project that is being thrust forward. And we wonder why during the Cold War, the United States went to the moon, and why have we not done something like that since then? Why has the majority of our innovations been directed towards consumerism and things that generally serve some sort of utility? And it's precisely because of the things that Schmitt outlines. And it's something even Evola talks about, and how hierarchy actually allows for freedom, and how true diversity comes from hierarchy. And you can go even with Nietzsche and the pathos of distance that he talks about in Beyond Good and Evil. So I guess going back to Gabriel, sort of going back to this idea that we're talking about and the mores of modernity. I guess, what are we going to do? What is the path, so to speak, to transvalue the state in a time where the very conception of the state is wrongly considered on both the right and left? And Lance just let me know that his internet crashed out. A certain people's we didn't pay our tax, our shekel tax, so they cut off Lance's internet, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just noticed that he left. I guess I'll just continue on because I did have a reply to you. So yeah, two things. Ultimately, and actually, this is funny you brought this up, because this was like one of the best discussions I had with Raul. It's an idea that really stayed with me. This was some months ago, and he brought up this point. We came to this conclusion that ultimately liberalism is it sets itself up in a way for failure. And what is meant by that is basically that because liberalism does not believe in the idea of collective will and of, or believing in, or it places no value on group identity and the will of those groups. So what happens is that eventually it makes its society so open that it lets in everybody else. But the problem is that everybody else doesn't adhere to liberalism. So when you start getting, migration from other parts of the world where they have very illiberal ideas and they do think of themselves as a group, it ultimately poses a threat to liberalism. Now, liberalism, in order to survive this, can do two things. But either path it takes, it'll cease to be liberalism. The first path is to surrender and let one of these fighting factions take over, and then it'll be some other state, maybe a theocracy of some kind. And then it'll obviously no longer be liberalism. Or liberalism can betray itself, its own principles, and then stamp down on these competing groups in order to sustain itself. And I think that's the more likely solution in the end, because I believe that all systems want to survive as systems and will ultimately adopt a form of self-interest, or and adopt a kind of tyrannical position if necessary in order to survive. And it'll probably look something like a more authoritarian form of liberalism, or maybe you'll just call it social democracy. It might not even be called anything different. It might just be straightly authoritarian in its execution, but still call itself liberal, which is what I think would probably most likely happen. Now, the thing is, obviously, that kind of state is still not a state that's sufficient to give us what we need as a society, because it's really just a bureaucracy fighting to keep itself alive as a bureaucracy. So how does one survive, or how does one actualize themselves when the state can't provide that for themselves? And I think ultimately the answer is pretty simple. Well, the states, these beautiful organic states that could cultivate culture even more than the culture that already existed, begin as a product of already existing cultures that precede the existence of the state, essentially. And I think ultimately the way to kind of get around that is to produce a culture that can, over time, ferment the conditions to where a great organic state can arise from that culture. And there was I've been in activist circles before, and I've listened to some of the things they spoke about. And one of the things that they said that I really resonated with me and made a lot of sense, that was that you can't really just run for elections and expect people to vote your ideas into power. You actually need to sort of impregnate these ideas into society for maybe 20 years. I mean, the left did this in America, and they became very successful in 30 years. In many ways, you need to have cultural revolutions, and the left knew how to do that. It's time for us to start doing that, and I think we are doing that in many ways, and I think we're being successful. And of course, this is where I'm going to invoke Hegel again, because I think it's important. Hegel talks about in the phenomenology of spirit. I forget the name of the exact section. I believe it's he's speaking of law. Or reason in law, one of those sections. And he says that, we create laws, we create, ethics, morality, and we have an idea of how they should be in our minds, and then we execute them in the objective world. We see that they don't actually live up to how we thought they were going to live up to. And then because of this, we have to then reinterpret the law and then cultivate it anew to actually adapt to the universal in his language, or just the community. And I think this goes back to what you were saying before, that what we're doing here is an evolving project, and it's evolving because through the process of spiritual evolution, it ultimately will sort of flourish into what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and it's I think again where I think Heidegger becomes quite prescient, and I would say pressing, especially in regards to technology, for instance. And we talk about the atomization of the individual within societies, and you think about utilitarian, the products of utilitarianism, and what can technology, if used incorrectly, produce as such. And this is something I talk about a lot, and I think that's very much why it's important to win the culture war rather than, as you say, playing the political game. And this is something that I think Evola again gets right. And probably my biggest, well, not probably, definitely my biggest contemporary influence would be Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani. And of course, I've spoken to him at length, both on podcasts and beyond that. But a philosopher cannot be a politician, because the political will always lead to compromise. I mean, you even saw this with the fascist movement, right? Obviously, regardless of how you saw it at the end, there was something even more vital and even more beautiful early on that did have to adapt for political expediency and did have to sacrifice aspects of its character over time because of needing to engage in the political. However, they didn't nearly have to sacrifice as much as for example, a party in a parliamentary or a liberal democratic system would. That would be even way more sacrificing of the core identity of whatever ideology that is. And I think that's important to consider when we think about what are the aims and the goals to work towards. And it's not really a political goal. I mean, it is in a sense, but as you've sort of said and laid out, fermenting the groundwork of for the future of the polity is not so much political as it is cultural, as it is spiritual, And that's another thing. I think it's important. I think too many people separate religion from the political, from the philosophical. Ultimately, there are very contrasting views religiously that are going to be brought up both in Europe and in America if the primary enemy is eliminated, right? If even after remigration happens, and you lead to a more homogenous society, there are still fundamental value disagreements that are going to have to be faced, because there is really no difference between the state, religion, and politics. This is what Evola presents with the Ghibelline figure. It's what he presents when he is essentially asserting that the ruling class must not be a separate priestly and military caste. And this is exactly where I think he's correct over Guénon. You can't have that separation, because ultimately the political and the religious are combined. I talked about this with Kevin Deanna in our conversation on pagan imperialism and the idea of Pontifex Maximus. Again, the Ghibelline figure, Holy Roman Empire contra the papacy, all these things. These values sometimes in contention with one another are going to have to be addressed. So, as you say, getting people elected, the political, all these things, ultimately, that is for expediency. Ultimately, that's just a small part of the bigger game. The true battle is almost a cosmic battle, as cliche as that might sound, in the sense that you're dealing with meta-level values. This is beyond these sort of, there's basic, take capitalism and Marxism, obviously, sort of reduced to the material. Let's say you got the capitalist utopia. Let's say you got the Marxist utopia. What then? What afterwards, right? And I think the same thing needs to be addressed on the right. People, for example, on the JQ, they act like, okay, once that's solved, everything's going to be fine. But no, there's as much divisiveness outside of all the main enemies, whether that's, radical Islam, the migration crisis in Europe. Political problems, are necessary to be solved, but there's going to be a whole other battle of values after all that stuff. And I think that needs to be addressed, like you say, through the fermenting of an early, on the ground blossoming of something for when the political, goals, let's say, get achieved, at least the short-term goals, that there's something to fill that vacuum and to be that next sort of sovereign sort of power to carry on, this new polity through what is inevitably going to be a tumultuous time. And I think personally that comes from fusing religion, philosophy, politics together. None of these things are separate. None of these things are on their own. They're all part of one general identity. And it doesn't have to be something universal. It doesn't have to be something which restricts the individual Dasein, but it has to be something which does assert a central orientation that people are, a central canvas, and each people's brush of their own blood is put onto that canvas and it's building towards something. This is what Schmitt is critiquing with liberal democracy. This is what I'm critiquing in regards to viewing politics and religion as separate, or politics and philosophy as separate. If there's not a central expression towards something, and like I said, people can contribute in unique ways as Daseins, right? But that greater being, that unifies beings, we're talking about unification versus universalism. Without that, we're going to be in a very tough situation. And I think really, even after these basic initial problems are dealt with, there's going to be a whole conflict over what comes after. And maybe you have some thoughts on, what that might look like, and then what the solution might be, and maybe just other thoughts as well.
Yes. You touched on some really good points there. I think, the homogeneity of nations, that to me, it's obviously very important, and it's an immediate issue, but it's the bare minimum, really. It should always have just been that way. It's it is a hard fight, and it will take some time, but I believe it will happen eventually. And like as I was saying, it is a bare minimum, because ultimately at the end of the day, before we got to where we were now, we were homogenous. And the reason we are no longer homogenous is because of a lack of the proper spirit preventing that from occurring. And I mean, you just see this with, a lot of white people who just hate themselves and their own culture. They're a big problem as well. And the sort of self-hatred is ultimately what needs to be driven out. It's suicidal. I mean, you can't have a society that survives if it completely hates itself. That's it's going against its own self-interest. It's just not possible. And I think that once normalcy has been restored, yes, there is going to be a fight, and it's going to have to be it's going to be a form of spiritual, psychological war where you're going to have to basically get everybody on board with the right ideas, and more so than just the right ideas, because it's not like everybody it's not like every normie, so to speak, has to go around and have conversations about, Heidegger or Hegel or Nietzsche or anything like that. They just have to have their instincts in line. And, that's actually quite, easy to do, because I think that people, if you leave them alone and you don't try to brainwash them with liberalism, I think they, sort of naturally revert to healthy, what I guess Nietzscheans would call life affirming instinct. It's only when you impose certain ideas onto them that manipulate and tap into their natural human empathy and thwart it in a way that they end up developing pathological ideas, which ultimately lead to the destructions of their own civilization. And because we're on YouTube, I'm not going to name who said this, but a very famous person with the name H, with the last name H, said that if you wanted to get rid of communism in Germany, you couldn't just do it by violently crushing communists. You had to actually offer an alternative, because to some level they were addressing valid concerns that people had in Germany at the time. And so just getting rid of them doesn't necessarily get rid of the concerns that they were trying to address that were very much real. The only way to combat spiritual enemies is to fight them spiritually. And that's ultimately going to be, in a way, the longest form of warfare I think we're going to have to deal with. Because getting state power, like if you actually look at the history of, like fascist Italy, for example, the fascist movement was, the fasces of combat was declared in 1919, and then the party formed in 1921, and then the March on Rome in 1922. I mean, that's, basically 4 years of 3 years of, actual practical politics being put in place. But if you look before that, the spirit to cultivate that, what was around for, all throughout World War I. So you needed that kind of precursor to allow those things to happen. And I guess leftists have their own sort of idea of this as well. I mean, Marxists quite literally believe that, before you could have communism, you need to have mass proletarianization, which requires, capitalism or mass capitalism. So that way there's an actual proletariat to create a revolution. Except, that doesn't really work, as I think we've seen historically. That's ultimately why Mussolini stopped being a communist, because he saw more of a revolutionary spirit in the World War I veterans of Italy than the simple factory workers. So I think ultimately, getting state power, that's kind of like a very much of a short-term thing that can occur within 3 to 4 years. What really is going to take a long time is to actually create a zeitgeist that's, in line with us. And I guess the optimistic note I will leave with on that point is that I think it's happening a little bit faster than we'd expect. I've been kind of involved in these kinds of politics since 2020, which is almost 6 years. And that's nothing compared to a lot of people. I mean, Raul, for example, I believe he got into these kind of politics, he told me, in 2015. So he was 10 years into this kind of stuff. But just even in that for some reason, that little period of 2020 to 2025, there's just been kind of like this mass red pilling, so to speak. And of course, it hasn't gone as perfectly as somebody like myself would like. But that's just kind of to be expected when things are vulgarized to the masses. And ultimately, that's just sort of a reality that we have to deal with. But it's better to have that than to have nothing, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think there also is a ride the tiger situation that's going to come out of technological acceleration. And another thing, this is something Nick Land talks about, is we might not even reach the point where these political issues are going to still be around. Well, we might reach the point of a vast, maybe not necessarily a literal technological singularity, but that next leap forward, let's say, of technological acceleration before these more pressing issues even reach their peak. And I think another way to view everything that's going on is, one thing I write about at length is this idea that I think people are negating the power of virtual reality and simulation too much. This stuff is getting very real very fast. I mean, people are killing themselves over ChatGPT. Both men and women are falling in love with, a non-sentient artificial intelligence. That's not even real artificial intelligence yet. It's just mimicking it. This stuff is going to brain fuck most people. I would say 99% of people. I think you're going to get to a point where simulations are going to be like video games that feel as real as this conversation that we're having right now. And most people are going to choose the simulation over real life. I think a ride the tiger situation is actually going to present itself where that 1% of the population, the global population, is going to be faced with the decision, right? Do you live for utility, the temporal, you live in this perfect simulation, or are you going to live in the real world where things are more difficult? But now the amount of agency that you're going to have due to this sort of global unintentional eugenics that's going to take place, are you going to be able to withstand that? Are you going to be able to ride the tiger and continue past the technological singularity? I don't know for sure when it's going to happen, but it might honestly happen before some of these political issues that you and I are discussing. And one of my funny, it's like half meme, half legitimate. One of the best ways to deal with mass immigration is actually to, once we have this technology, to just flood it in Africa, in the Middle East, flood these, VR porn simulation type things. It sounds funny, but like legitimately, I think in the next 10 years, you're going to reach a level of simulation that's going to feel like real life. And once you have all these people who naturally are less focused on the sublime, this sort of pursuit of the sublime, the pursuit of a forward view of history, of progress towards something. This is a very Western idea. It's present in other cultures as well. The Iranians, for one. I think it was either Nietzsche or Hegel who said the Iranians are the only people with a philosophy of history. Beginning with, I believe, either Mithraism or Zoroastrianism. But for the most part, you go to Africa, for instance, where there's been very little innovation in the past 50,000 years. Probably, human history is probably, past 200,000 years. So you can imagine that once you have these technologies that fulfill every ounce of utility for these people, that they're gonna fall for that quickly because they don't care about the transcendent or the sublime. So I think, another angle to view all this is strengthening the mind and strengthening the spirit for the technological singularity. And I'm not saying we should grow complacent, but it's another thing to consider is that this is going to wipe out a lot of people, especially the liberals, right? Who live for sensation, who live for temporal phenomena. They're going to eat this stuff up. It's going to give them everything they want. I mean, look at already the TQ. I mean, how many people are becoming trans because they're addicted to porn? How many people are becoming trans because of all this, just absolutely mind-frying shit online? And it's going to be 10, 100 times worse. So, I guess what I'm getting at here is another thing to look at with what we're talking about is another mode of preparation, which is preparing the mind for this shit. People, most of these big tech elites don't allow their kids to be unsupervised on iPhones or computers because they know the inner workings of what this does neuropsychologically to young minds. You know, it's worse for people younger than us. So, you know, we have it worse than somebody who's like 35, for instance, but there's people younger than us who have it worse. Their minds are going to be completely fried growing up on this shit. So we're going to reach a point of, you know, where this issue becomes pressing. And can you ride the tiger? Can you overcome the singularity? And if you can, there's going to be a battle of the best and the brightest at the end of the tunnel there, where most people are going to be brain fucked by, you know, post-modernity or post-human history. And whoever can withstand that, assuming we don't end up with this sort of Nick Land Terminator Matrix future where the machines and artificial general intelligence overtakes us, which is a possibility, but, you know, one that I have my own views on how we can circumvent. But what I'm getting at here is that's another angle to look at this, is political issues could be surpassed by a more monumental issue, which is, you know, this inevitability, because I think AGI is inevitable, or something resembling AGI is inevitable. I guess I kind of just want to ask you if you have any thoughts on that, or if that's just something that, you know, you haven't really, you know, more focused on the political, or is this something you thought about as well?
Yeah, well, this is actually, I've thought about this a lot. And the reason I've thought about it a lot is because it's kind of like infected my personal life. Not because I'm using any of this stuff, but because the people around me use it a lot. But before I address that, I want to add to that point you made that it is going to surpass, I think, the main political issues, especially of immigration, because I remember earlier this year, I don't remember when, maybe March or April, there was a whole thing where Keir Starmer, who everybody knows is a left-winger, had to address the immigration issue in England. And this is kind of proof of the things we were saying before, that, you know, because anti-immigration sentiment is growing so strong within these European countries, even the left is going to have to start addressing them, or else they will lose legitimacy. And the reason they want to do that is not because they really care about immigration. It's because they want to win elections, and you can only win elections if you are in tune with the spirit of the people, which is exactly what is the precursor to you know, the organic state, or a state that's actually working in tandem with the society that it rules over. Now, when it comes to AI, yes, I think it is going to wipe a lot of people out spiritually, at the very least. I think, and also, you know, in terms of jobs, now that can see in terms of jobs, that can also be a good thing, because if it wipes out low-skilled labor, then that kind of destroys the incentive to you know, import cheap labor, because obviously you're not going to have to pay the machine as you would have to pay, you know, somebody from, you know, India or something. And obviously it's in the corporation's interest to save as much money and, you know, create as much pecuniary gain as possible. But in terms of, like, yeah, my personal life, I mean, I've seen a lot of people, there's a lot, it's oftentimes men, you know, these guys that I work with, they were, I overheard a conversation not too long ago where they were talking to each other. They were excited because I guess Grok had released a form of Grok that you could speak to it and it would flirt with you sexually. These guys were excited. Like, the one guy was saying to the other guy that, oh, when I'm going to come by your house and show you this later, you know, make sure your wife's not around or whatever. It reminded me of, like, when I was a little kid, not a little kid, but like 8 years, I guess being 8 years old is a little kid. Like, when, you know, I'd be excited to go play the new Call of Duty with my friend, you know, after school. And, you know, I would, like, run to his house, or he would come to my house. It was, and these are two, you know, grown men in their 40s getting excited to talk with Grok that would flirt with you. Two married men, by the way. They're not, like, you know, incel chuds or anything by any means. But, and I saw that, and it disgusted me on a multitude of levels. I couldn't believe it, honestly. And this happened more than once. And you know, if it can penetrate itself into the minds of what you would normally think are, like, well-adjusted middle-aged men, you could only imagine what it's going to do to someone like my age. You know, I'm 22 years old, and I could only imagine what that's going to do to people. I mean, the brain doesn't really stop developing until you're 25, I think. So even now, there's probably enough neuroplasticity to really screw somebody up if they get involved with this stuff. But yeah, that was one thing that really, like, woke me up to that. Like, it was in my face. Like, I had to actually contend with somebody like seriously saying that kind of stuff to another person.
Yeah. And, you know, the reason I bring that up is I'm trying to see it at, obviously you can black pill from it because look, it's going to affect a lot of our friends, at least the lesser of our friends, our family, all these things. It's going to wipe out, the majority of people. In my estimation, this is obviously just, speculation on my part, but I don't see how most of society will be able to resist this stuff because even we can sort of understand, like let's say you and I would want to be Caesar, right? You could be Caesar in a simulation. Why would I want to be 1/100th of Caesar if I'm very lucky? Why would I want to be 1/100th of Caesar in reality if I could be, 100 times Caesar in a simulation? So, I mean, I understand the appeal of it. I mean, and then this is going to happen. I mean, look at all the people who already live vicariously through the blue screen. To quote my conversation with Kevin Deanna, something he was saying, like that's no way for the youth to live. But largely, I mean, in a lot of ways, that is how they're living, through the blue screen, through simulating reality. And once the simulation is so good, it's going to be like, well, what's the point? Especially the way liberals live now or boomers live now. There's not really anything they're going to be missing out on in the simulation versus reality because they don't have this forward reaching, sort of progress towards anything. But what I'm getting at here is there's a white pill out of that. And the white pill is that it's going to wipe out the right people and it's going to keep the right people. Or let's say it's going to wipe out the wrong people. Let's say it's going to keep the right people, because ultimately those who have a higher impetus to want to be a part of something are going to prefer the perhaps less colorful reality. At least, artificially, the simulation will be more colorful, it'll be more vibrant. You can have harems, and be an emperor in the simulation, but people with a higher impetus are going to have the strength to resist that, are going to have the strength to still want to be a part of reality. And the people who are going to be easily, like the modern bug man, right? Nietzsche's last man, those are the people that are going to be swallowed up by this, enveloped by it. And there's good out of that in a sense, as horrible as it's going to be, because it's going to be the equivalent of a mass genocide, not a literal genocide, but a spiritual genocide. It's a mass exodus of people from life into the hyper reality, let's say. And I guess, the reason I'm bringing this up is, and maybe my question to you is like, do you kind of agree or disagree seeing this as a white pill, seeing this, like I said, let's not get complacent, but seeing this as the ultimate test, and assuming my premise is correct, that it's actually going to result in a more eugenic population. You don't need the labor caste anymore. You don't need the peons. This is something that Giorgiani sort of outlines in Prometheism, is that the people that are left are going to be the best of the best, are going to be elites, are going to be able to pursue real beauty in real life, with more technologies, by the way. We are going to be able to, Spengler, essentially was painting the Faustian West as reaching its end, largely because that Faustian nature could not be acted upon any longer once the age of colonialism had ended. The whole world had been discovered, but now a whole new age of colonialism, galactic colonialism, is going to be opened up to us. That's going to come with a lot of beauty to that. And I guess, I'm long-winded way of saying, like, do you agree or disagree seeing this as a potential white pill and something galvanizing for a more beautiful and better, humanity?
Yeah, I do, because it's ultimately what it is. It's just a massive selection event. There's this guy on YouTube that I watch frequently. He kind of touches on stuff similar to this, a little bit less philosophical, like we are. His name is Gerbert Johnson, or Gerbert's Void. He's got 2 channels, young, around my age, and he, we spoke about before, rather, sort of like, in order to create this beautiful, like, organic state, it first requires a beautiful organic base from that state to arise out of a organic, or a beautiful culture, a healthy culture. We have the opposite of that now, where you have A lot of isolated people. Apparently, there was a study that came out where it was, I don't know if it was just young men or if it was Zoomers in general, but it was definitely Zoomers uh, are living at home and alone the most. Of course, you cannot create a culture if everybody's stuck in their home all day, not interacting with one another. Culture presupposes the interaction between a multitude of individuals. Um, and what makes this technology, in this case, a more potent selection mechanism to destroy uh, the lesser spirited, so to speak, is really just the fact that it's immediate. I mean, like right now, I could just pick up my phone and start scrolling, Instagram or Twitter, and completely lose myself in it for 5 hours, maybe, or just anything. And there are people that do that. There are people that do, that just sit in a room all day on the computer doing whatever, various things. And it's actually, it seems like that is exponentially growing, and it's going to be more people. Um, I know it's a cliche phrase, but like the phrase touch grass, I mean, it is kind of like, it is good advice, but ultimately it has to be something higher than that. You have to, it has to be there has to be community. So what we have here is really two things that I think are going to produce a mass selection event, the one that you speak of. One, mass atomization, and two, the immediacy of basically blinding yourself with pleasure through these technologies. Um, I'd also like to add that both these two things basically they feed off each other. If you're atomized, you have nothing to live for. Of course, you're going to pick up the easiest thing to numb yourself and distract yourself from the pain of that reality, and that's going to be the immediate pleasure of these technologies. So there's ultimately going to be like this death by hedonism. Um, but that being said, there will be people who recognize the threat of this kind of stuff. They will be able to, either not use these things at all, or have the will to moderate themselves in how they use them. And ultimately, I think those people will come together because those people are, if they're strong, if they're headstrong or spiritually strong, they will kind of try to find community, because you need community. Human beings need that. And if they realize that they're lacking one and that there's a common interest in creating one, they will create a community. And ultimately, having a community is more beneficial for organisms that want to survive. Those who survive, that's why human beings are naturally tribal. And those who remain atomized and blinded by hedonism, they won't make it. I mean, they probably literally won't reproduce either, because they're going to replace, reproduction with an actual human being, with the sort of like pseudo form of these. A while ago, I think, I don't know how many years ago, but one of my first videos was on the sort of phenomenon of like, I use Baudrillard's philosophy of simulation and simulacra to understand this e-girl phenomenon. And I kind of came to this conclusion that what you have there is you have women in real life mimicking technological forms of a woman, which aren't real women. And what happens is basically that you now have, it used to be the case where technology was mimicking humanity, but now you have a sort of reversal of that, where it's technology that first mimicked humanity produced a altered form of humanity that's not real, but now humanity is mimicking that. And that's eventually just going to, and the reason it's mimicking that is actually really important to look at. The reason it's, these girls who dress up as characters that aren't real is because they realize that there's a market for that. There's a mass appeal for that. And the reason there's a mass appeal for that is because of the mass. It's almost like the people who use these technologies are kind of possessed by them. And if they weren't possessed by them, if they weren't infatuated with them, then, obviously there would be no reason for, this sort of, this extension, this outburst into real life, for people to mimic these completely online fake forms of human existence. And I think that's also something that should be noted. It's a symptom of a much larger issue.
And even beyond that, sort of building off of, you bring up Baudrillard, And this is a slightly off topic thing, but I think it's absolutely important to read leftist philosophers, because there are some very good ones, even if ultimately we would disagree with them. Even Deleuze, and what he has to say about schizophrenia and the body without an organ. There is value in that. Essentially, viewing this figure who seeks that beyond utility, that beyond the sort of manufactured desires, as an almost overman figure. And of course, some people call Deleuze a crypto-fascist, surprisingly. But going back to Baudrillard, again, one of those guys, on the political left, the post-structuralists, who actually I think has a lot of value for we on the right to consume and to read. And going off of what you're saying, I would actually shift it a little bit to, for example, like films, and like social media. One of the things I hate the most, and I'm sure you can agree with this, this is something I hate with a passion. This whole red flag, green flag, toxic relationship stuff. It's all bullshit utilitarianism. Like, the guy has to do this. If he doesn't do this, it's a red flag. Relationships are not about these perfect fucking green flag, whatever bullshit. Beautiful relationships are like D'Annunzio and Alina, or Andrea, and Alina in fucking Il Picari, or Il Picari, The Pleasure, whatever. My thoughts are going a lot of different places now. So it was kind of, this toxic, beautiful love story. A lot of D'Annunzio's both in personal life and then in his writings, sort of reflect this, or you go back to the tragedy. Like, I hate so much. And again, it goes back to Baudrillard, because women are starting to act this way. They see how on social media that portray the way a man has to be, the sensitive, caring, blah, blah. It's no longer about this great man who a woman is infatuated with because he's pursuing life and he's trying to conquer life and he's trying to go forward. You can't be an Odysseus anymore and leave Ithaca for 20 years. And his wife stays loyal for 20 years and they kill all the suitors in the end. It's this very triumphant thing. And by the way, they also kill the servant girls who sleep with the suitors. I don't think they're going to allow that in the Christopher Nolan Iliad. But the modern day relationship is this very cucked fake man. If you look at a lot of films and the perfect relationship, it's usually this sort of nerdy, sensitive guy. And while the main female character is getting ran through, being a slut, she eventually realizes how good of a guy he actually is. Oh, I'm done being ran through. I'm going to be with you now. And you see this a lot in films. And I think this gets imprinted on the sort of modern man. Or even look at like Kamala Harris picking Tim Waltz. Like, he's a caricature of a man, and it's the less caricature of a man. And it is sort of this hyper reality where it's a simulation. It's a simulation of what you think you should be looking for, what you think your life should be like, what you think this red flag, green flag bullshit should be like. Life is not about utility. Life is not about the perfect this or the perfect that. It is about pain and pleasure and dynamism and frenzy and hatred and eros. Eroticism is lost today. It's lost in sex as well. And I'm no prude, by the way, but there's no seduction anymore. People are hooking up at the same day. And like I said, I'm not a prude, but you need that artistry to living. Nobody lives like art anymore. And this applies to relationships. This applies to masculinity. This applies to femininity. And I think it does go back to Baudrillard and how he sort of, the signs of modernity and like hyper-capitalism, all these things, they produce these very cheap mimicries of what once was the signs of something vital, right? And this is why precisely we're monumentalists. We're not antiquarians necessarily, right? Who look to conserving what was, and we're not critical like the leftists trying to break everything down. We're monumentalists. We're building something new, inspired by the past, inspired by that evolving ontology, rooted in things, rooted in mythos, inspired by mythos, but not being constrained to the past, but using it to build into the future. But I know it's a little bit long-winded, but I guess I completely agree with what you're saying, but framing it in that way as well. I just think it's very pathetic how everything's supposed to be a certain way. Everything's supposed to fit this perfect sign, this perfect utilitarian, this is how it is. And we need to get back to, in a sense, transgression against this bullshit new moral objectivity. The new left are not moral relativists, right? They are not what they claim to be. They're just positing a new moral objectivity, which is frankly disgusting and weak and stultifying, and just leads to these androgynous sort of pathetic, the sort of stereotypical leftist man and woman. And this isn't by any means the majority, right? But it's a big enough majority that, I go to college now and I notice it a lot. It's androgyny, right? It's a lack of distinction. Hierarchy posits the distance and difference, the pathos of distance and difference that leads to Daseins expressing themselves as unique identities. Leftism and liberalism and universalism are crushing that into one atomized sort of archetype that you should be. You should be the safe sort of, non-transgressing, non-triggering individual. And it's just bullshit, pathetic, gray utilitarianism, constraining the Dasein into something just crushed and cocked. And I don't know. I mean, I know that was a little long-winded, and now I'm just getting more evocative rather than deep thinking. But
no, it's all good stuff. Because it actually made me want to bring up a couple points. You make this point that like real love, real passion, it's messy. It's a very messy thing. And, the whole I know exactly what you're talking about. If you spend any time on the godforsaken thing known as Instagram Reels or something like that, you will see exactly, it's a green flag if a man does this. It's a red flag if he does that. And ultimately, I think, people, well, especially in this dating market, because there's a dating market crisis. This is obviously a point that's been talked about, to a large extent. And part of that, I think, is just because people have created this hyper ideal that's so unattainable, it keeps them in a state of paralysis. And that's ultimately why people will end up dating AI girls or boyfriends eventually. I think, at the current point in time, these things appeal more to men than they do women, but I would not be surprised if eventually they do appeal to women just as much, because women are definitely also attracted to words. That's why they are, the majority of consumers of erotic literature. And the reason that people will choose these AI kind of substitutes for relationships is because they can be programmed to check all these green flags, so to speak. But the problem is that these can't, if somebody is a more spiritually worthwhile person, they'll realize that this sort of fake quote unquote perfection is not, it gets boring. But the part of what makes relationships, but especially, if you're in love with somebody, what makes it fun is that there's real risk involved. There's the risk of losing the person, which makes the struggle for them and to keep them and to attain them. It's kind of like a fight almost. And it's, oftentimes I'll have like an experience where, I'll be working on a YouTube video for a long time, and then I'll put it out and I'll feel like this great euphoria for a day. And then by the next day I'll feel like, okay, well, now what am I going to do? And people who are known to have a lot of relationships, players, so to speak, a lot of them aren't really doing it for the relationship always. They're also doing it for the love of the pursuit, which obviously you're not going to get with an AI girlfriend or whatever. You just log onto your computer and talk to her. Now, you also made a good point about how, like, in the media, this sort of idea of like the ideal man now that's being put out there is this very, submissive sort of, I call them, macho men. We've all seen, people, they call them like the performative male. That's kind of the new thing. Yeah, like it's exactly that. And now there is, and it's funny because a lot of men intuitively find that disgusting, but their form of resistance to that is also equally disgusting, because what they do is they create like this sort of like, grotesque bodybuilder. And I'm not against lifting weights. I think I lift weights. I think everybody should. But like they do like this sort of like hyper, it's almost like, there's this term, hyper modernity, where there's like an excess of, of goods, of it's sort of just like the fruits of capitalism basically coming to destroy the people who brought those fruits there, so to speak. And then so like this combat to the feminization of man is like this overcompensating form of masculinity that looks cheesy and inauthentic to a degree that a lot of men have adopted because they've also been fed that. Where like ultimately, like yes, like D'Annunzio is much more of an idol to look up to, or Mussolini is much more of an idol to look up to than Chris Bumstead or something. Which isn't to say he's not like you can still respect him because it does take work to do what he did, of course. But it's like there are other forms of work that are much more of a higher caliber, so to speak. And so I think like there's actually kind of sad in a way that like if you are a young guy, you don't have access to the wealth of knowledge that we were lucky to have access to, and you have an intuitive disgust towards the feminization of man, but then you feel like you have to sort of adopt this sort of this pit bull masculinity that's almost like it is also in itself performative too, if you think about it, because it's so inauthentic. It's not actually tapping into anything.
Yeah, like Andrew Tate or something.
Yes, exactly. That's a perfect example. I mean, there's this guy, and as a person, he seems like a really just nice guy. Sam Sulek, he's very popular with Zoomers.
Yeah.
But like the whole, like you'll watch like one of his vlogs or whatever, and it's like, okay, so like a lot of, and people associate that with mask. I mean, he himself, I don't think is doing that. I think he just wants to excel in the sport of bodybuilding, which is fine. But like a lot of people who watch that probably have the idea, oh, this is what it means to be a man. It's to whatever, get juiced up or whatever. And it's like, well, if you ask me, like what's the best form of masculinity actualizing itself, I'm like, I don't know, the March on Rome. Like it's a completely different, it's a completely different question for me, and I think a lot of people in our sphere. So
no, I definitely agree. To me, it's less about the issue with that is less about the actual aesthetic, like physical aesthetic, as the intention behind it.
Yeah.
Because I would actually say somebody like Ziz, for instance, right? He was the sort of steroid bodybuilder, but also he lived a very Dionysian, almost artistic lifestyle. I don't know if you ever watch his edits, but I find those very invigorating. He sort of was a frenzied individual. And the way he portrayed himself was, it wasn't to me this pit bull masculinity. It was a little bit performative in the good sense, not the gay leftist performative male, but performative in the sense that D'Annunzio was performative. I mean, he literally was performative, but in a theatrical, very machismo sort of way that did have, a sensitivity to it. And not, again, what really sucks is I have to preface all this, like, when I say sensitivity, people are instantly going to think of in the leftist way, but I think you understand what I mean by that. Or even like, there's that famous picture or video, I think, of Mussolini smelling a rose, like there's it's not a cheap masculinity where it's like, oh, I'm smoking my cigar. I'm fucking my girls, Andrew Tate pimp bullshit. It is artistic. Even somebody like Raul, there was an artistic side as well. He wasn't just this guy who was like, trying to be all, it's like what you're saying. People overcompensate, right? And then they stray away from like maybe like an early Roman or Greek masculinity where you are a work of art, you're a living work of art, and people get away from that. So to me, like when we talk about like Bumstead or Sam Sulek types, the issue isn't so much the aesthetic. Obviously, I don't like Ronnie Coleman aesthetic, like I don't like, but like, take Z's, for instance, pretty like nice lean physique, blah, blah, blah. The issue is the intentionality behind it and how it manifests. And, if people just try to, mimic what they think masculinity should be, and it goes back to Baudrillard again, right? it becomes a simulation rather than a dynamic evolution and, a genuine being, a genuine Dasein with an expression, with a unique expression. And you see this in academia today. Nobody's creating new philosophy. There's like 3 people I can call philosophers in the 21st century. And it's because nobody's being original anymore. Everyone's mimicking. There is no originality. There is no expression, assertion. And that manifests in a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And like, like with and like you said, it isn't necessarily about like the product of what these guys are doing. It's more so just it is the intentionality. And for them, it's the bigger I am, the more masculine I am. It's very like, primitive in the worst sense of the word form of masculinity. Whereas, you have, well, the thing is like, like there's this phrase that's been going around, and I hate Zoomer lingo. But it's kind of slightly gotten a little bit better. Like the one word that everyone uses now is aura. I hate it, but it's also like it is a good word to use. So I'm going to use it. But when somebody has aura, you could distinguish between fake aura and real aura. Just like, and it's almost like intuitive to a degree. It's the authentic spirit coming out of a person. It's actually very subtle. That's why people say, someone has aura. It's like they don't even have to say anything. They could just be standing there and you could feel it. That was said about many great men. It's really the way they carry themselves. It could quite literally just be the way they walk. It could be something so minute that could speak. That could be a window into something greater, essentially. And that's not performative per se, because they're doing it unintentionally. Whereas you have like, the whole like matcha performative male meme is like, the guy's reading feminist literature, drinking the drink, obviously, has whatever, dresses in a certain way. It's peacocking, essentially, was an older term for that kind of thing. And the reason people detest that and it's become a meme is because it's so obvious that person is really not who they are when they do that. They're trying too hard to be something they aren't. And
also, why would you want to be that, right?
Yeah. Also, why would you want to be that? And obviously, the answer is, they want to attract, female attention, which is kind of funny because, like, it's kind of like a Chinese finger trap in a way. It's like the more you try, the more people are going to be repulsed by you. You're better off just being yourself because that's really all you can be at the end of the day.
I guarantee you, this is funny. I'm sure you would agree to this. If you went to your average, like, whether it's a party or a club or a bar, let's say like 100 times you told some girl, oh, I'm a feminist or I'm a communist, whatever. And 100 times you told them I'm a fascist. I guarantee you're going to end up with a net positive success saying the fascist line, Yeah.
And also you would end up with a positive success just because it throws a wrench in like the normalcy of life. Because, they're probably expecting some guy to come up to them and say that. If you completely shatter their expectations, or like the Lacanian real or whatever that people speak of, it actually even goes beyond women too. Just to like anybody, it captivates them to a degree. I mean, not everybody. I'm sure some people would probably flip out on you and try to harm you or whatever. But
the majority, but like a large minority within that would be like, holy fuck. And even the majority, they're going to be thinking about you for a bit, even if they blow you off. Yeah,
exactly. You're gonna. I had a friend of mine who got into an argument with somebody online, and he said something. I forget exactly what the person had said to him, but his reply was, "I didn't come here for you to like me. I came here for you to remember me." Which I was like, I thought that was a really brilliant line. It even struck me, and he wasn't even saying it to me. And I'm like, wow, that is a really beautiful way to put it. To be remembered, not necessarily loved, is kind of the way to go in many ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's primordial. There's a reason why we remember Achilles over Hector. And that's not to say Hector was a bad man, because he was a good man in a genuine good way, not good in the modern false good a man should be. He was a genuine good man. But we remember Achilles precisely because he was arrogant, because of his hubris, because of his of his brashness, right? There's that line in the film Troy where Briseis says, "I've known many men like you," and he's like, "No, you haven't," and he was right. And I wrote about this at length in my last essay. It's the myth of Icarus, not the myth of Daedalus, right? We remember the transgressive, foolish, we remember those who not necessarily present themselves to be liked or loved, but to be known, to be remembered, as you say. And I think, that applies to the relationship thing. This is why I hate the modern red flag, green flag bullshit. And that's why I hate utilitarianism and hate utility, because that's exactly what it does. It reduces and it takes away from that vital beauty, that bleeding of life. And that just reflects in so many different ways. And of course, look, I was in high school. I went to an all boys school. For those that don't know, I've talked about this before. So I was a late bloomer, let's say, when it came to romancing. Initially I kind of tried to fit that archetype that socially had been sort of presented, right, as the noble sort of ideal, the false noble ideal. And, throughout my life, eventually I just, started being who I was, and everything changed. When you stop trying to mimic and look, obviously we're all LARPing to a certain degree, but there's the LARP that you intentionally, genuinely choose to LARP as, and then there's the LARP that you feel you ought to LARP as,
Yeah.
And there's a difference. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had some tweet the other day that said LARP so hard that when you LARP, you end up no longer LARPing.
Yeah, I remember. I saw that.
Yeah, and I was like, what I really meant by that was basically just like, well, there's forms of LARPing that are so like, if I went up and dressed up as a Teutonic knight and started walking around the street, okay, it wouldn't really do much. It would be kind of like a failed form of LARPing. But if I like looked up to a certain kind of spirit, try to embody that spirit as best I could, at first I would be LARPing, because I'd be adopting something. I'd be trying to mimic something that I wasn't. But eventually, if I sort of ingrained that into myself over time, I would turn into a new person to a degree, and then I would no longer be LARPing. I would actually be that thing, however it is manifest in the real world. So that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah. And, we are coming up on 2 hours, ended up being a little longer. So we kind of start wrapping it up. But yeah, the way I finished my last essay is I said, be Baudrillard with courage, embrace the hyper reality. Because at a certain point, these things are inevitable, right? It's which simulation are you going to choose to live? Because, there's obviously, I'm saying deny the video game simulation. That's a real, like, literal simulation. But there is that simulacra within reality, which also exists and is inevitable and is going to be something that we have to confront and contend with. And if that is inevitable, then you have to face it in your own way. It goes back to the being to death that Heidegger brings up. We're temporal beings. You're going to have to deal with the finitude of being at some point. There's a lot of different ways to deal with it. How are you going to deal with it? And it's same with this. You're going to have to deal with it. So why not, if you have to emulate something, if ultimately you're going to be artificial to a certain extent, and this is where synthesis comes into play, right? Because you don't have to just be one thing. Why not synthesize and emulate the greatest and the brightest artificial things you can?
Exactly.
Embrace hyper reality, which is like kind of what you were saying with the LARPing. And
well, I guess we could just wrap it up here. Thank you a lot for having me on today. And the original topic of this was all of our friends, RAUL Giammatteo, and well, if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be here today. So in a way, he is alive through this conversation, I would say, at least here on Earth. And yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we'll continue the spirit that he set out, and we won't forget him. And he lives on, obviously, in whatever the hell this is that we are embodying. He lives on in that, whatever you want to call it. By many names it goes, but he lives on, and we will not forget him. And now he's going to live on in this conversation You know, he's on the thumbnail for this video. People will see his face and they'll remember it. And I'm just happy to be able to do that for him. And like you said, you know, I think we probably would have met eventually at some point, maybe in 2026. But obviously, you know, we've talked sooner because of this. So, you know, like you say, Raul lives on, and you know, he is present with us, right? You know, like where is comrade Raul Giammatteo?
He's here. Yep.
He is here. He is present with us. And of course, you know, I'll sort of end this. You know, I have a thing I say at the end of all podcasts, which is, of course, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. But for today, I will say this: to whom death?
Correct. Us.
Indeed. But yeah, thank you, Gabriel, for joining. Thank you, Legionaries, for watching. If you've watched this far, you get a Roman eagle delivered by drone to your doorstep. But as always, thank you, Legionaries, and we will see you next time. Ave Nova Roma.